Also a warm welcome from my side. I think it's becoming almost a annual normal thing to meet to discuss about the Global Competitiveness Report. This year we're a little bit earlier because we wanted to create a strong link with what will be happening next week in China, which is our annual meeting of new champions, where we will want to have a more in-depth look at what it needs to relaunch growth and what kind of economic company approaches it will need and what new companies it will need to actually make that happen. But before giving it over to Jennifer Blanke, who is leading this effort, I just wanted to quickly share with you how important the Global Competitiveness Report and all the work related to it is for us. This will be the 30th edition of the Global Competitiveness Report, which I think is all in itself a proof of its soundness, its importance, and also its long-standing wish to help better understand what can help competitiveness go forward. I would also like to point out, and I think all your presence here is a clear sign for that, how important this report also is for helping discussions between private and public actors on what is necessary to further competitiveness and, as we very strongly believe, also further growth in the different countries. I also would like to share with you that even if that sometimes becomes the main topic, which is a little bit the who is first, second, third, I think that is, at least for us, not the most important, not to say probably the least important part. But I think what is important for us is to make available on a scientifically very sound basis criteria to look at economies in different countries and better understand where could be the challenges and where actually good advances have been done to give public forces means for understanding and designing their political go-ahead, the frameworks they want to create, and on the other side also help business to understand where they should probably engage into dialogue with governments to further foster that. But here I will stop. I'm very glad to see such a big group of you attending here. As my colleague Matthias Lufkins from our communications department said already, this is a pre-run. All this information is embargoed until Tuesday, the 8th of September at 9 o'clock. But I think it is very important for us to have a chance to share it already with you and start the discussion like every year, because at the end of the day, this is only a starting point for a process to help us all better understand where to go and what to do. So welcome, and thank you very much, and I would like to invite Dr. Jennifer Blanke to actually share with us the details of this year's Global Competitiveness Report. Thank you very much.
Thanks, André. Thank you so much for being here in such large numbers. I never recall ever having such a large crowd at our pre-launch before. Before going into the details of the methodology and the rankings, I just wanted to first recognize the small team that has been behind this effort, because, as you can imagine, there's a lot of people who have worked really hard, particularly over the summer, to get this out in time. And so I just wanted to quickly recognize around the room the different people who have been working on this very, very hard. Kira Brown, maybe raise your hand. Margarita Janet, in the back. Irene Nia. Thierry Geiger, the one boy on the team. Pearl Samandari, who I don't know if she's here. A few people are working outside. Eva Trujillo up in the back. And Carissa Sali, who I think is also outside. So 8 people basically working very hard on this project. So basically what I'm going to do today, and I think most of you are actually new, but some of you have been with us before to look at these. I will go through the methodology, so I apologize to those of you who know this very well already, but I think it's important for everybody to sort of be on the same page and understand where the rankings are coming from, because as André said, it's not really the overall ranking that's important, although it does capture attention. It's really the details behind it that are useful. So I'll first just say a few words about the Global Competitiveness Network, the work that we do on our team. After that, a bit more about the Global Competitiveness Report, which is the report we're launching, and it's our main report. And then specifically about the Global Competitiveness Index, which we've been using for several years as the main vehicle for measuring competitiveness across a large number of countries. And finally, a few words about the rankings and some of the highlights of this year. As André mentioned, this is an exciting year for us. It's our 30th edition of the Global Competitiveness Report. It is the main report of our team, and we do a number of others that I'll show you in a moment, but this is really the key report. We launched it back in 1979, and at that time we were covering only 16 countries, European countries. But over time, as we sort of took on much more of an international focus at the World Economic Forum, we included more and more countries from all regions, and as of this year, we're covering 133 countries at all stages of development and from all regions. Professor Klaus Schwab, who's the head of our organization, is the editor and actually founded the reports back 30 years ago. And again, as André mentioned, our goal is really for providing a tool for dialogue between business and government on thinking about improving competitiveness. I just wanted to quickly mention a few of the other reports we do that some of you might be aware of. We do a lot of benchmarking studies, either topical or regional. We do an annual, and pretty soon it's going to become biannual, travel and tourism competitiveness report looking at that industry. We do a global information technology report every year. Recently we started doing a global enabling trade report, which we launched recently at the WTO. And then we do a number of, also the Global Gender Gap Report, which is something we've been doing for a number of years, also a topical, and then a number of regional reports on Europe, the Lisbon Review. We've done a couple of country reports in Latin America, and we're also doing every other year an Africa Competitiveness Report. This year, we're planning on doing an India Competitiveness Review, and also sort of a Southeast Asia report in the coming year. So, back to the Global Competitiveness Report and the reason that we're all here. What is it that we're trying to actually measure in this report? This basically shows in purchasing power parity terms the evolution of GDP per capita in 3 countries since 1980. We have Chile, Korea, and Nigeria. And basically, it just shows that on a per capita basis, GDP has increased at different rates. There has been a bit of an increase in Nigeria. Chile's done quite well, actually, really increasing living standards quite impressively, and then Korea's sort of off the charts. Korea tends to be the poster child for this sort of thing. So basically, we're trying to understand why is it that some countries have done a better job over years at providing rising living standards for their citizens. Why is this interesting? It is a very comprehensive report. It has basically the most comprehensive data set on competitiveness, both in terms of the sort of breadth of issues that we cover as well as the number of countries. We're looking at sort of comparative strengths and weaknesses across countries. Countries can really benchmark themselves across any groupings that they're interested in that they think are useful. And it's not something that we do on our own. We work with a number of leading academics and also sort of institutions, universities around the world. Some of you might have heard of Xavier Salih-Martin, who's one of the world's sort of leading growth economists. He's at Columbia University. He's sort of the mastermind behind the model that we use. And we also work with partner institutes in every one of your countries who both help us to gather the data that we need for doing the analysis and then also disseminating the information afterwards. Those tend to be universities, business organizations, research institutes, and so on and so forth. This is just the last bit of information before sort of going into the model. We use 2 different types of information or data in the report. We use hard data, and that's data that you'd be familiar with, and always basically from the key organization that is responsible for the data. So macro data, we try to get as much as possible from the IMF, education data from UNESCO, IT data from the ITU, and so on and so forth. So this sort of measures the quantities that we're trying to capture in the report. In addition, we also use data from our own source, which is the Executive Opinion Survey. And this is a survey that we carry out every year in every country where we ask business leaders, basically CEOs and other top executives, to compare their environment to an international standard. And this provides key data, first of all, for sort of issues where there's no such thing as hard data on things like corruption. If you want to know if it's happening, you need to ask people if it's taking place, but also on quality, qualitative data. So we would use the UNESCO data on education levels, but then we would ask the CEOs how well do they think that they're delivering a quality education system in the country. And this is our country coverage, everything in gray. So as I mentioned, we're covering 133 countries. There are some areas that we're still not covering entirely. A lot of the time, because it's very hard to carry out surveys there. We're a bit less prevalent in Central Asia, some Central Asian countries and some African countries, but we are endeavoring to increase the coverage as much as we can. But at this point, we're already covering more than 98% of global GDP. So basically, the stuff that we'll talk about today is pretty global in scope. Now, to the Global Competitiveness Index, sort of the crux of the analysis. What do we mean by competitiveness? Because there are many different definitions out there. Sometimes people might be talking about price competitiveness or different things. And sometimes people will think about it in the sense that you would think about competition between companies in terms of a share in the world market for our country's products. And that's really not the way that we think about competitiveness, which is sort of a zero-sum game. The way that we do define competitiveness is as the set of institutions, policies, and factors that determine the level of productivity of the country. Because at the end of the day, it's really productivity that will determine the rising or non-rising living standards of the country over time. And in that sense, you're sort of, all boats can be raised at the same time. The other thing to take into account, in the beginning when we started doing this this exercise, we were covering, a small number of European countries. As we included more and more countries from around the world at different stages of development, we started thinking about how can you actually rank countries next to each other when they really depend on very different factors at their particular stage. And so we've specifically modeled into the index this concept, a simplified concept, but a very clear concept of stages of development. And the idea basically is that countries will go through 3 stages that we specifically use in the model. Countries will start off in a factor-driven stage. At that point, they're basically competing in prices and low wages. You will produce there because it's cheaper to do so than elsewhere. But that if they're competitive at that stage, that prices will rise, wages will rise, and at some point they can no longer compete by being cheaper than elsewhere. At that point, we would say they're moving into the efficiency-driven stage, where they have to start doing things better than elsewhere, more efficiently. But you again have the same sort of scenario where if countries are very competitive at that stage, prices will rise, wages will rise, living standards will rise, and at some point you end up, at sort of a high-tech frontier, so to speak. You end up in a place where if you want to keep enhancing productivity, you can no longer do it by being cheaper or just more efficient than elsewhere. You need to be coming up with new products or processes. And those are countries that are in the innovation-driven stage. So that's sort of the way that we think about it. And we basically model it in by weighting factors a bit differently. Everything will matter for all countries, but we'll weight some things a bit differently for different countries. And I think you can sort of see that here, and I'll discuss it in a moment after I describe sort of the very specific elements that go into the model. Now this, what I have on the screen, and I'm sorry for the people in the back that can't see it, but I'll go through them. We basically have 12 pillars of competitiveness that range from the more basic to the more complex. And I'll just mention them quickly, particularly for the people in the back that can't see. The first pillar is institutions. And there we're looking at both public institutions, which are things like governance by the government, also the structures in which people are interacting, property rights, independence of the judiciary, the extent to which the government is displaying even-handedness in its dealings with the private sector. But we're also looking at private institutions, so corporate ethics and things of that nature. So this is also very important. Infrastructure, so energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, telephony. Macroeconomic stability, and there it's sort of all the classic things you think of, like budget deficits, debt levels, inflation rates. The fourth pillar is health and primary education. And there we're looking at the health of the workforce as well as the quantity and the quality of primary education. So those things needed really for carrying out basic tasks. The fifth pillar is higher education and training, and there we're looking at the quality and quantity of secondary and tertiary education, as well as on-the-job training that's provided by generally the business sector, but in general. The sixth through the eighth pillars are looking at markets, goods, labor, and financial markets, and how well allocated these factors are in the economy. Obviously, financial markets getting a lot of attention of late. The ninth pillar is technological readiness, and there we're looking really at the extent to which companies in the country are adopting technologies for productivity enhancements, whether they were invented at home or abroad. So we make a distinction between that and innovation, pure innovation, which is the 12th pillar. The 10th pillar is market size, just because this basically allows for enormous economies of scale, large consumer bases, and so on and so forth. And finally, the last two pillars that are the most complex are business sophistication and innovation. Business sophistication looking at things like clustering, the quality and quantity of suppliers, the extent of delegation within companies in the country, and so on and so forth. And finally, innovation, which is really looking at the innovative potential of the country and how it's represented in terms of patenting. So, I mean, that basically gives you an idea of all of the stuff that goes into it. As you can see, those of you who can actually see the screen, we've organized them, the different pillars into 3 different sub-indexes, each of which are particularly important for a country at one of the stages of development that I just mentioned before. And so the first 4, sort of institutions through health and primary education will be very critical for countries in the factor-driven stage as they move into the efficiency, and also the efficiency enhancers will also be quite important. But as they sort of move up the value chain and as prices and wages rise, they will have to start doing things more efficiently. And finally, countries basically that are in the innovation-driven stage, the weighting is more or less equal. So for countries that are at the more basic stages, we won't put too much weight on the more complex things, but more and more as they move up. Because they can still get a big kick in their productivity, basically, from just getting their institutions right or building better infrastructure. And this basically, we won't go through it, but we allocate countries into stages of development using 2 criteria. The first is GDP per capita at market exchange rates, which we use as a proxy for wages, since there's no good comparative wage data for so many countries. And also to take into account the fact that some countries are really very much sort of mineral-based or basic, their economies are based on sort of what they pull out of the ground, so to speak. So even if they have high GDP per capita, it doesn't mean that they're becoming more advanced. We also take into account the extent that their sort of economy is composed by minerals. And finally, what we've all been waiting for, the rankings from this year. And I think a lot of you have already looked through them. I'll just say a few words about some of the various countries, particularly at the top, and some of the top performers in the various regions. And at the end, I'll mention who you should talk to after on specific country cases, because we will be here for a while afterwards if you want to talk about your own country in more detail. I think one of the big stories this year is the fact that Switzerland has overtaken the US. The US has been ranked first for quite a few years. And basically the story is that it's not that Switzerland is doing better, but Switzerland has maintained its performance since last year, while other countries have actually seen a strong weakening, such as the US, and we'll talk about that in a second. In fact, if you look at the absolute, because you have to remember that these are relative rankings, so one country going down actually benefits another. On an absolute basis, Switzerland is a little bit less well assessed in terms of its financial markets, and particularly its banking sector, which I think won't surprise anybody here. But there's been less of a weakening than in other places. And since Switzerland still has so many other strengths in terms of its innovation capacity, in terms of the quality of infrastructure, the quality of its institutions, it really helped to push the country up to first this year. Now the counterpart of that is that the United States has gone down by 1. And this is something that we have been sort of expecting for some time, and this year it happened. Basically, I don't think it'll surprise anybody, why this is happening. There have been imbalances that have been building up over time in the U.S. economy in the macro area, combined together with the weaknesses that have been shown in the financial markets. And these things, the U.S. has been going down over time in these areas, but it's been exacerbated by the crisis. And finally, it took enough of the toll to knock the U.S. out of first place. And in fact, the U.S. was quite ahead in terms of its score last year, so it really went down by quite a bit this year, but still so competitive in other areas in terms of being an innovation powerhouse, the quality of education, and sort of the collaboration in innovation between the business sector and the university sector, well-functioning labor markets, and so on and so forth. So the U.S. still is among the top two, but some of these weaknesses clearly will need to be addressed going forward. Singapore has moved into third place this year, and Singapore is sort of a similar story if you kind of look at the numbers. It's that Singapore has maintained its performance compared to last year, so it was fifth, now it's up to third, and it just continues to do very well. Singapore always basically gets the best marks in terms of the institutional environment, and actually even gets better marks this year, while a lot of other countries are still weakening in terms of the perception of how well the public sector is doing their job. And also, Singapore has amazing infrastructure, excellent functioning markets, among the top in the world, and high focus on education. So all of these things basically come together to make Singapore one of the top three. Continuing down, the Nordic countries continue to be very well placed in the rankings. They're ranked 4th through 6th, well, particularly Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. Norway is still doing quite well in the top 15. And these are countries that continue to benefit from having excellent and very transparent institutional environments, good at infrastructure, and also that very strong focus on education over time that has been important for basically spurring innovation. I'm not going to say too much about every other country. Germany, Japan, still in the top 10. Still doing quite well. Japan, same story, which is it's an innovation powerhouse, incredibly sophisticated in terms of its business culture, but macro imbalances have been quite a problem and continue to be. The United Kingdom is ranked 13th. It started sliding. It actually slid out of the top 10 last year, and it continues to slide downwards this year by one more place to 13th. And that is basically linked to a continuing weakening of the perception of the quality of the financial markets in the country. Iceland is kind of a similar story. Iceland, I don't have them up, but Iceland goes down by 6 places this year. There, it's really, they completely, crashed in the macro area, which I think is not surprising given what happened over the past year in that country. Just turning to some of the other countries and some of the top performers in the various regions, we see that Qatar, for the second year in a row, is the top-ranked country in the Middle East, North Africa region. It is followed, I don't have the Emirates up after, but it's directly followed in the rankings by Emirates. We've seen that in the Gulf, countries continue to go up in the rankings or to maintain a pretty stable performance. And overall, in countries like Qatar and the Emirates, there's been a lot of investment in the productive sector in recent years, using their sort of windfall oil profits and improving the functioning of the markets and trying to spur technological adoption. And this is really paying off in terms of their competitiveness rankings. China goes up by 1, and actually this sort of brings up a phenomenon that we saw this year in terms of the BRIC economies, the large emerging market BRIC economies, which is that 3 of them went up and 1 goes down. So Brazil, India, and China, especially Brazil, but the 3 of them go up in the rankings, so continuing to maintain or even improve their competitiveness, sort of performance and their economic outlook over time and even during the crisis, whereas Russia actually went down quite a bit in the rankings. So now Russia is the lowest ranked of all the BRICS for the first year, because Brazil overtook Russia this year. But China's still well ahead of the others, and now really well placed in the top 30. Other than that, I might mention Tunisia, top-ranked North African country, again, well-functioning institutions and really quite strong, particularly by regional standards. South Africa, top-ranked sub-Saharan African country, exactly the same performance as last year. Basically, the ranking hasn't changed. continues to do very well on some of the more complex factors, particularly business sophistication, innovation potential, but weaknesses in some of the more basic things like health and security, and so on and so forth. So I might just stop there. That was just to kind of give you a flavor of what's going on. We're going to be posting everything on our website